Welcome in to the Monday edition of the 14. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Blake Lovell with me today. And my goodness, Blake, we've got a lot to talk about. We've got baseball, basketball, and football news as we do this podcast. This is a fun time of the year because there's a lot going on in the SEC right now.
Yeah, lots happening. We saw, of course, spring games and football, and we know baseball is kind of in a very fun stretch here with lots of good series that I know we'll talk about today and tomorrow with Barry. But, also you've got everything, like we said, the transfer situation in college basketball is wild. So, yeah, lots happening and plenty of activity going on in the SEC right now.
Let's start with football. You had a chance to watch the Georgia spring game. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think with Georgia, they're going to have some pretty good playmakers as you would expect with that team. I think, obviously with guys like JT Daniels and you look at someone like Zamir White and those kind of guys. I mean, it's Georgia's. I think they're going to be fine. Like it's a situation where you're going to look at some of these young players they've had that are probably going to develop into some pretty quick playmaker. I mean, guys that are going to be able to come in right away and be able to make some big plays. And as I always say, with these spring games, sometimes it can be a bit of a mixed bag. You don't really know exactly what you're going to get. But I saw some things from Georgia, which, again, as you would expect for a team that's going to be picked, where they're going to be picked. I mean, there were obviously a lot of positives. You can see the things that they're kind of, building towards, I think, overall. For coaches, sometimes they're going to look at this and see this as a learning opportunity. I think Kirby Smart, at least to me, seemed to be, pretty happy with some things that he saw. And I think their offense is going to be very intriguing to watch. Then, of course, their defense, they're going to have playmakers there. They'll be able to rush the passer and that kind of stuff. So there were notes, that you can take away from it. But again, to me, there's just, you can see certain guys that make plays, but overall, it's just, it's a spring game. It's a long way to go. But there were certainly some positives you could take away from it.
How much you think the Pickens injury hurts them?
Well, I mean, it's significant just because, the type of player he is and what he can do when we talk about, obviously, with playmakers. I mean, when you have someone like, George Pickens who can make a lot of plays, I think that is something that, it's going to change a certain dynamic, certainly within, their offense. And there were probably a lot of things that they would have been able to do, with him on the field and be able to have some certain packages and different things you can do with that. But not having him, I mean, that takes away an element for defenses, especially where it's like, okay, well, now we can turn our attention elsewhere. But it's going to be something I think you probably get a bit more of a grasp on as we get closer to the season, maybe go throughout the summer and start to see some of these guys, elevate themselves in different positions, but on that offense. But I mean, look, it's a very talented player. He's a star, and not having someone like that on the field certainly changes at least a certain aspect of your offense, and pretty, in this case, probably pretty considerably. But I still think they have some guys, like I said, that will be able to make plays. It's just, when you take away a guy like that, it changes some things.
Yeah, I'm going to need to do some catching up, and thank God for the SEC Network because I didn't get to see much spring football this weekend. But it sounded like Georgia was pleased with a lot of young defensive backs. I mean, I know they're having to reload there, but what were your thoughts as you watched those guys break in?
Yeah, I mean, the defense is, look, I rarely have any issues or concerns with Georgia's defense, even if, maybe some years they've had better personnel than others, but I think overall, that Kirby Smart's going to have a pretty big hand in what they're doing defensively, and I think you feel pretty confident that they're going to, again, have a chance to probably be a team that can rush the passer. They've got a lot of playmakers on that side, I think, that'll, be able to certainly challenge the offensive line. And I thought you kind of saw that in the spring game, too, where you saw, them kind of have some opportunities. They had a lot of tip balls. I think you saw some, a lot of balls get tipped off the line of scrimmage and that kind of stuff. And so that was something that I thought stood out. But, with the defensive backs, too, it is it's a young group because you did lose as many guys as they did, to the next level. And so that could be something at least early on. I mean, as we said, it's one thing to see it in the spring game. It's another to go out and play Alabama or Auburn or teams like that, and just you're having to maybe defend things that you haven't seen before at that level. So I think that'll be a storyline that you probably look at going into the season. But overall, I mean, I still think that they've obviously got a lot of talent in that part of the defense in the secondary, and I think they're going to be fine. But as we said, it is a little bit different. Maybe trying to gain a real grasp of what you're going to see in game in the spring game versus actually doing it against SEC competition in the fall. So
yeah, I think spring games are wildly overrated, but I get it. Fans don't get to see, and they want to see something, and they're starving for any bit of info they can get. But yeah, I mean, I've seen spring games where guys stood out that didn't do much the rest of the spring and didn't end up doing anything in the fall. But again, I get it. People want to see something, and we're starved for info, and that's that. But let's talk Alabama for a minute. Bryce Young was kind of the guy on the spot there with Mac Jones graduating, and he wins the MVP of that game. Again, I didn't get to see that one either, but I guess the talk coming out of Alabama's spring game, after maybe some injuries, obviously, would have been his play.
Yeah, I mean, and look, when all the talk heading into the NFL draft is going to be about Mac Jones and where he goes, and does he wind up going 3 to the 49ers? Does he wind up, falling further down? I mean, that's the kind of guy we're talking about having to replace. And so I think when you look at it from that aspect, all eyes are going to be on Bryce Young in terms of what he's going to be able to do. And I think right away, I mean, we knew that this was going to be someone that, coming into Alabama, you could tell like he was that type of guy, as, one of the best recruits in the country. And, a lot of things on that offense, which I think are going to be interesting too. I mean, when you think about the offense and Steve Sarkisian now at Texas and all that other stuff, I mean, there are always going to be changes like that. But I mean, this kid's really good. I mean, there's a reason why he was the number 1, number 2 recruit in the country, best quarterback out there. And so I think it's pretty clear that you could see some things. Again, I didn't get to watch their entire one, but I did see some some of their when he was out there. I mean, there were some of the things that you could just tell right away that stood out, and you're like, okay, yeah, that's a guy that should be the starting quarterback for the best team in the country, arguably. So yeah, I think you can certainly see the tools just right away with him, and it's just a matter of seeing how some of those other guys develop on the offense. Because again, it's not just you're not just losing Mac Jones, you're losing other guys too. But I think he's someone that pretty clearly can be that guy that's going to step in right away and make a lot of plays. So.
Well, and it probably helps that he got a little bit of experience last year, including some reps against Ohio State in the title game. Yeah. I mean, you always want to go into the fall with a guy who's played some there, so that's good. I mean, and then when you're Alabama, look, it's nothing new, right? They blow out so many opponents. I think that's one thing Nick Saban. Well, I mean, it's him. He develops the talent that blows people out. But that's one thing where the rich get richer at Alabama because they're able to get so many underclassmen, so much experience every year because of that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's, that is something that I think is kind of undervalued sometimes, is because, you are in those situations as often as they've been at times where you do have guys that get an opportunity to maybe get that experience early that, otherwise maybe in the situation they wouldn't be able to get. And so for him, I mean, and I think just to, being in that, like you said, being there, that year and just kind of being able to learn things. And that's always something too. I mean, it's hard just to come in right away anywhere, which we've seen guys do it before. I mean, don't get me wrong, but, in a program like that, the pressure, the expectations, like it isn't always easy just to step in right away and have that success right off the bat. So I think just having an opportunity to, learn the system, learn things, understand sort of how things need to go to be successful at Alabama, that probably helps someone like him too, going into a season like this where all the pressure is going to be on his shoulders now as the starter.
Going across the state there, I guess Tank Bigsby was the big story of Auburn's spring game. Sounds like Auburn's going to go under center with Mike Bobo, who's their new OC, under Coach Brian Harston, who, of course, came from Boise State. Sounds like the defense did a lot more maybe than the offense did in that one. Again, didn't see it. Derek Mason, the new defensive coordinator down there for Auburn. I don't know if you got a chance to see any of that and take anything away, but what did you think about what went down at Auburn?
Yeah, I saw a little bit of that one too. Just kind of, flipping back and forth. Like you said, it's hard to keep up with everything at one time just because you've got a lot going on. But yeah, I saw a little bit of it just in terms of, I think it's going to be interesting. You've got a new coach there, like you said, with Harson's there, and then you got Derek Mason who's taking over the defense. So I think Auburn's a pretty, intriguing situation for me because it is, you've got a different situation because for so long, Gus Malzahn was there and we talked about all the different things, you kind of expected from them offensively. And now you kind of look at it and, it's going to be a little bit different. Certainly, it's not going to be the exact same scheme. There's going to be things they do differently. And so I don't know that there was a ton just for me watching that, again, the parts that I watch, which I'll too, like you, probably go back and see a little bit more this week just in terms of things that we missed. But I think, we mentioned Tank. Come on. This guy's really good. We know that. And I think there are some other things you can take away from it. But I still feel like, especially when you have a new, which I'm sure you'll be able to speak to some of this on Vanderbilt, but I think when you have a new coaching staff, this is what we talk about with the spring game where it is so early still, in terms of having a staff that's putting everything in, getting adjusted to the players getting adjusted to them. I think you get much more of a feel from where a team like Auburn or some of these others, that have new coaching staffs like Vanderbilt, like we said, I think you probably get a much better feel of where they're going to be maybe later in the summer versus right now, because I still feel like there's a lot you've got to sort of get everybody on the same page with when it comes to the system and everything that they want to do. So I think, certainly there are things you can take away from it, but I always kind of reserve forming a full opinion on these types of situations because I just think when you have a new coaching staff, it's still so early on in terms of, kind of where things are at and where they're going to be probably closer to August. So.
Yeah, that's a good transition to flip to Vandy for a second. I was at that game. It was interesting. The offense dominated. They had this scoring system to where the defense got points, the offense got points, and the offense won like 63-29. And I think the offense may have literally scored 63 points, like by a normal scoring system,
Right.
because they dominated. And Ken Seals was one of three quarterbacks who took reps. I thought Mike Wright, their running guy, looked really good. Ramon Davis, the transfer running back from Temple, was good. I think he's going to help them a lot. And they had wide receiver Will Shepard, who had 3 touchdown catches. He's a freshman who played a little bit last year. And really, those were some athletic plays too. But boy, my takeaway from that, God help Clark Lee with that defense, because it was the same defense I saw last year, where they don't have any speed and they're not very physical up front. And that's a pretty fatal combination in the SEC. Now, listen, I think they said they tried to keep a lot of their things simple, and I'm sure they'll continue to work in the weight room and everything. But when you start that far behind the SEC, the way that I analyze things is I kind of take what we know already, which is how guys have performed before. And I kind of use that to break the ties or to clear up uncertainty. And kind of what we knew of that defense last year was it was horrible. And I didn't see a whole lot that he's got to work with. It is pretty astonishing to me how bare that cupboard is defensively that Derek Mason left.
Well, and I think you go back to last year, right? The one thing we kept talking about with and we've always said this with Vanderbilt. It's especially defensively, like you need to be able to force takeaways. If you're not going to be perfect on offense, if you're not going to be one of these teams that's scoring 45 points a game and you've got all these offensive weapons that you can just score at will, you've got to be able to force some turnovers, and you got to be able to force mistakes. And like they didn't really do that at all last year. What was it? I think they only had how many interceptions they have last year? It wasn't many,
it was one or two.
I was going to say it's only 2 maybe. Yeah. And so like that's what I was thinking of when you talk about that, and you kind of look ahead and you're like, okay, boy, if this defense is not going to be one that can do that type of stuff, which I would hope this year, they're probably going to have more than a couple maybe interceptions and that kind of stuff, but still, if you can't force any sort of mistakes defensively, that means offensively you better be very, very good. And like you said, there were some things you could see offensively for them that were highlights, but still, you and I were kind of talking about it before we came on, but I was laughing and said, hey, well, I guess if you're going to lose, if as long as you can put up points, I mean, fans would probably rather you lose, 55 to 42 than losing whatever, 24 to nothing. So I don't know. I think, like I said, that's one where I don't really know what the expectations are for them this season. I think, I don't expect them to be a team that many people are going to look at very highly going into this year. There's clearly some rebuilding they have to do. And maybe it's just a matter of seeing, if the offense can come along. But you kind of know where things stand defensively, and that's going to be a problem if they can't score points.
Yeah, if you like points, they might be a team to watch because they're going to give up a lot, and I think they might score some
Yeah.
too. Again, they've got two entirely different quarterbacks. I like some things I saw from their receivers. They got a couple of tight ends they can use, and their offensive line. The one thing last year they lost two starters who opted out for COVID, and the third guy, probably their swing man, opted out too. So they've got three guys coming back who could have been starters last year. Well, what that did is that let them develop other guys. So now those old guys are coming back with the new guys, and all of a sudden they have some depth on that line, which is going to help. And my goodness, that offensive line, and again, I think this probably says more about the defensive line than it does the offensive line. But I'm not kidding when I say a couple times they blew holes in that front that you and I and Barry Allen could lock arms and skip through.
Yeah, that's not ideal, is it? Yeah, so that is something. And I mean, I don't know. Like you said, I always, when you have these new changes, like you said, whether it's Harsin at Auburn or Clark Lee at Vandy or wherever, I think you always try to find some of those optimistic points early that they can build on. But you also see some of the things that stand out as though, okay, I don't know that they're going to be able to fix that problem this year, or that problem. Those are the kind of things that I think you're kind of glaring when you see kind of a coaching change where it's like, okay, maybe this guy in a couple of years is going to be able to get things more balanced and get it back on track. But then you also, like we're talking about with the defense, and say, well, I just don't see him fixing that in year one. And maybe that's going to be the case this year. So.
Yeah, if Clark Lee wins 5 games, I'm just going to say it now. He should be SEC Coach of the Year,
right?
Because he will have earned it.
Yeah, that'll be a challenge probably, but
yeah, you kind of can't have defense heading into an SEC season. That's a little bit prohibitive to success. But did you see LSU at all? I mean, 4 quarterbacks played there and played a lot apparently.
Yeah, I was going to say I that's one I saw less of than I did see most of Georgia one. I saw bits and pieces of Bama and Auburn. I saw probably, I don't know, a few minutes of LSU just based on other things going on. But yeah, I mean, that's, it all starts with the quarterback. And at least at this point, very curious to see kind of what direction they go in on that. Because, I mean, I don't know. Like, I mean, look, they're coming off a national championship a couple of years ago, but I feel like at least heading into this season, it's an interesting year for LSU, just based on, again, I mean, you kind of look at where things were last season. Obviously, not the kind of season you want coming off of a 15-0 year national championship type season. So I'm kind of curious where that team lands this year because, I mean, it does start with the quarterback position, but, there are also some other, I think, issues at other positions. And so I don't know. I'm curious to see where they go and maybe what, let's say they do have sort of a, I don't know, maybe a down year. But what does that kind of look like for them heading into the next season and Ed Orgeron, that's kind of stuff. So I'm kind of curious about LSU. So
that is, I think, the most variable situation in the league. Seems to me right now because, look, they won a national title 2 years ago. They upset Florida, but it just seems like there's turmoil down there with the Title IX investigation and Orgeron's deal with Darius Geis and the turnover at defensive coordinator. I mean, LSU should always be good on defense, and they were dreadful last year. So I just don't know which way this is going to go. I mean, it is interesting when you start to hear hints of hot seat talk pop up when you just won a national title 15 months ago. I mean, it's just an odd deal down there right now, it seems to me.
Yeah, I was going to say, it has not been that long ago since they won the national title. And so, I mean, I don't know. I do think that's one where, like I said, if this season were to, let's say they have another 500 season, which I mean, I think they'll be above 500, but I mean, let's say they, go 7, I don't know, even something like that. Let's say they win 7 games, 8 games, maybe. I don't know. I kind of wonder when you compare that to some of these situations and everything, like you mentioned, that maybe just some of the the stuff that's talked about down there, maybe off the field stuff. I don't know. There's a lot of ways maybe this could go for them, but it is going to kind of quarterback position. That's what it's going to come down to. Probably offensively, what kind of success they can have. Miles Brennan, I think someone that that's been there, an experienced guy, and be able to maybe see what he can do offensively if that's the direction they go in.
Does Brennan end up with that job again?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think, there a lot of people were talking. I mean, which, as you said, I mean, they played four different guys. But, Max Johnson, I think someone who, had a pretty strong finish to last season. I think he's someone that will be right there. And maybe people already feel like that there's a clearly defined direction they're going to go in. But for me, I would think it's probably one of those two, certainly. Whoever, I mean, again, as I said, Johnson's the one that started started the last couple games of the season last year. So, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure because there were some things you could see, and as I said, I didn't get to see a lot of their game, but I think when I was watching it, Johnson was in there, and he was, I thought he's pretty impressive in terms of just probably the couple offensive series I saw that he was in there. So it'd be curious to see kind of which direction they go in.
I think Mike Leach wasn't real happy with what happened in Starkville Saturday.
Well, one thing I know about Mike Leach is that he is not afraid to express his opinion. I do think we can all agree on that. So that's what I like about him, though, right? Because we talk about these spring games, and sometimes you can really paint a pretty, you can paint a pretty picture if you want to. But I think that for Mike Leach, he's going to paint the picture exactly as is. And what was it? I think he says below average or something like that. He was not really a big fan, I think, of some of the things that they did. So that's what I like about him. You're going to get transparency from Mike Leach, and so yeah, I think you kind of know where they stand. That's where maybe it's hard to know where some of these other teams stand because you're going to get coach speak and that kind of stuff, but you're not going to get that with Mike Leach. Yeah, he didn't seem too thrilled with some of the things. So
that's another weird situation because I have to think that year two, given his offensive mind, they take a step up, but he's lost a lot of players. I watched him last year. I'm not super certain how much talent he's got. I mean, Will Rogers was pretty accurate with the ball last year, but they didn't go for a lot. The throws weren't very long. I just don't know. That's another one to me that I put up there with LSU is just like, I'm not sure which way this goes because I could see it breaking one of two very distinct different ways.
Yeah, I mean, look, they hired him for what? Like they hired him because I think people were very intrigued by the possibility of the scoring and how many points this team could put up and his offense and just the uniqueness and the style, all those different things. But I think this was the conversation, right? Whenever he came into the SEC, was everyone's talked about, well, he's done this at Texas Tech, he's done this at Washington State in terms of this offense and then putting up, points and that kind of stuff. Can you do it in the SEC? Can you do it consistently? And I don't think it was fair last year to just right away say, oh yeah, he's going to come in right away. And I mean, they scored points, but it's just like you said, they're going to have some roster turnover. And how quickly do you get back to doing those kind of things? And can you kind of take that step to resemble an offense, like we said, that maybe we're so used to seeing from a Mike Leach type team over the years? Whereas, you go back to last season and there were times where they really struggled. And I wonder, with that, it's a matter of having the personnel I think, to run probably the type of offense he wants to run. I don't know if the expectations last year were ever, for Mississippi State to come out and win 8 games or anything like that. I just don't know that a lot of people thought that was going to happen. But I do think that this is an interesting season just because I think people want to see, okay, offensively, like this is why we hired this guy, was for the offense, and for, maybe them coming out and throwing the ball 85 times a game or whatever. And I'm curious to see kind of how they come along offensively this year. Because again, I do think that was the biggest draw of the hire was people were so intrigued. They were so fascinated by what this guy could do offensively. And maybe that was going to be kind of that competitive advantage they could have, is having this offensive genius and being able to run the system that nobody that can stop. But I think SEC defenses, that can be a little bit more of a challenge just given the competitiveness of the league. So, I think Mississippi State's one of those teams I'd put on the short list in terms of very interesting to see kind of, do they take a big step forward this year? I don't know exactly what the expectations are going to be for that. But I do think people would, like we said earlier, we were laughing about the Vanderbilt thing. If you're going to lose, put up 45 and that kind of stuff. But I don't know exactly that they're going to be to that level. Maybe some of those great Mike Leach teams we've seen before are going to be at. So,
any other football-related thoughts before we move on to baseball?
No, like we said, I like you mentioned, I think I get it. I understand why. It's exciting. You get a good chance to see what teams could have going into next season, but we're still 4.5 months away from really knowing exactly what's going to be on the field. As you said, there are guys that have impressed in spring games before that maybe don't see the field when the season starts and those kind of things. It's a long summer until we actually get to this, but it is kind of exciting to look out there and say, oh yeah, like I'm really excited to see, Bryce Young in this role and what's going to happen with the LSU quarterback situation and all of these other storylines. So that gives you kind of a nice little appetizer to get a good idea of what we're going to be talking about come September.
By the way, I'm trying to get us a draft guy on this week with the NFL draft coming. I've made the contact trying to negotiate a time. This guy's really busy. I'll put it that way, but he's a name people know. And if we can get him, it'll be a big plus for the podcast. So stay tuned for that if we can pull that off. Baseball. Let's see. We leave the weekend with what now? 2 teams tied at the top, Vanderbilt and Arkansas. Vandy takes 2 or 3 at Tennessee. Arkansas takes 2 or 3 at home against A&M. You got 3 teams at 10-5, Mississippi State, Tennessee, South Carolina. Ole Miss, which got off to that fast start, now sitting there at 9-6, along with Florida. But I guess the headliners were State, Ole Miss, and Vanderbilt and Tennessee. One home team takes a series, one road team takes a series. I'll throw it to you for a minute, then I'll have some thoughts. What stuck out to you in terms of baseball? I know you didn't get to watch a lot because you were doing spring games, but what caught your eye?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me, and and I know this was the case too at Mississippi State and Ole Miss with that series too, but just how fun was that Vanderbilt Tennessee series?
Oh my goodness! Yes.
That's what I thought really stood out to me was. And we say it, I mean, all the time when you've seen some of these sporting events that have brought fans back and all this other stuff. And we've seen this kind of over the months now. It's not just something that's completely new. But, I mean, that's what to me was the biggest thing that stood out was, and look, like I said, you get the same thing with Mississippi State, Ole Miss, and that kind of stuff too. Like it's these rivalry type scenarios in these games where it just makes it so fun. And I thought that atmosphere, in Knoxville there was just unbelievable in terms of seeing that crowd, seeing the atmosphere for that entire series. It was something else. And that honestly was probably the biggest thing. And again, that's not to take away anything else from any other games we've seen, but I thought it was so glaring in terms of how awesome was that just from a college sports perspective, to see that type of atmosphere and just kind of the emotion and everything surrounding it, knowing how big of a series that was, for both. And for Vanderbilt to be able to come out of there and, after the way the game ended on Saturday, just to be able to come back and win that game on Sunday, just what a fun series that was.
Yeah, game 2, the most interesting one of that series, Jack Leiter gave up 3 home runs, which he's now given at 4 in his career. And to provide context, the ball really gets out of there at Lindsey Nelson Stadium. It's 320 down the line to right. It's 390 to dead center. So there's some balls that get out of that park that are caught on the edge of the warning track at a lot of places, but that's the way the park plays, and you deal with it. I think the wind was blowing out a little bit, and I don't know that a lot of those balls needed help, but it didn't hurt. And certainly makes it tough to pitch in that park. But Evan Russell, I know that Tennessee lost the series, but he was kind of the story of the week, and he hits 4 home runs. He hits 3 on Saturday, including a walk-off. And I had a buddy of mine in the media who was there, and I talked to him Sunday night. I just asked, what was the atmosphere like? He said when Russell hit that grand slam on Saturday, it sounded like it would at Neyland Stadium if they do a go-ahead touchdown in the fourth quarter in a big game. The atmosphere there, and I know they limited attendance. I think there were 2,500, maybe 3,000 people. Apparently, there may have been more than the capacity that was allowed, which
Yeah,
I'm
I
not
would say
knocking.
that's pretty good. Yeah,
People are ready to get out and do things.
yeah.
But I heard it was really just electric there.
Oh, I was gonna say, like I was watching. It's funny because I had again watched bits and pieces of it, but I had turned over just as he was coming up to bat, for before he hit the grand slam, and I had heard the crowd, like he had come up to bat, and the crowd was already kind of they're excited, obviously knowing what's at stake there, and everything that had already happened prior in the game, but they're already going wild, and then for some reason, I think like this was when maybe I was switching back and forth between I don't know, it was one of the spring games, probably Georgia, and I for some reason like the guide came up on the TV, and like so I didn't actually see it, but I heard the noise. I was like, what in the world just happened in that game? Like as I had, I guess, the TV on guide or something, and I pushed it back on quickly, and I'm like, oh my, he just hit the grand slam, and it was like I was like, that sound is unbelievable just from that moment. But it's my goodness, that was something that was the biggest thing for me that stood out. As we've said, we've seen that at other places thus far in the SEC, but I just thought for Tennessee, which is a team we talked about a lot this season, just based on the ascent of that program. Well, what a series, and I know they didn't win it, but still, like that was something where that shows you, like, man, do people care about SEC baseball? They absolutely do, and I think it was pretty obvious. When you have teams like this that are so good, these top 10 teams, man, there is just the atmosphere was awesome, and as we said, it's been so long. Heading into a season like this, where not having last season and that kind of stuff, it's just pretty fun to see that kind of atmosphere.
I think you could debate that the two best storylines in the SEC this year, for this calendar year, are what happened at Alabama this year with basketball and Nate Oates. And by the way, I'm excluding Arkansas and Eric Musselman, not because that accomplishment was insignificant, but because we know that Arkansas can have a passionate basketball crowd.
Yeah.
Muss just brought it back, but we know that. But the passion that you saw at Alabama for basketball this year, and now what you're seeing at Tennessee for baseball, for a fan base that honestly hasn't cared in a long time, I think those are two really positive developments for the league.
Yeah, no, it's pretty cool, like you said, in terms of just seeing. And that's what I always say. I mean, like it or not, people like a winner. Like it's much easier to be able to go out and you want to support your team. Like that's the thing, is you want to be able to support them, but sometimes if the product on the field or court or wherever just isn't good, like it's not easy. And so I think to have that kind of atmosphere, that's what I thought was probably the biggest thing for me, was just to watch that game, be like, wait a second, like we're watching a Tennessee baseball game here, with that kind of crowd, that kind of atmosphere. And I saw someone on Twitter post like driving up to the game before one of those. I think maybe it's the Friday game, and you just saw the line, like all the people just waiting to get in. That's something we usually reserve for football, but to see that with baseball was pretty awesome. So,
well, in the Mississippi series, it's weird because State wins that series, but in between, Doug Nikhazy, who's been that number 2 starter that really is an elite guy when he's on, that most teams would kill to have, was that. I think he throws a one-hitter, but State wins the series anyway. That was one of those kind of mixed blessing weekends, I guess, for Ole Miss, which is now lost its last 3 series. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's won one game each time, which helps, but that was in Starkville. I guess that's the expected outcome. You probably, when two teams are fairly evenly matched, you go with the home team. But Ole Miss, I'm not going to say the Rebels were reeling, because that's not fair, but you certainly would have liked to have seen the Rebels taking one of the last 3 series. Now, look, that was at Florida, Arkansas, and at Mississippi State, so it's not going to be easy. But that was an interesting outcome in between those 2 state wins, because I think at least Ole Miss had something that it could take out of the weekend that was encouraging.
Yeah, that's what you said. I mean, I think that if you just win one of those series, like you feel a little bit better, just based on, like you said, maybe it's not reeling, but to lose the way that they have, I mean, to lose 2 of 3 to Florida, Arkansas, and Mississippi State, it's not, it's certainly not ideal. But now I guess if you're Ole Miss, you come out of this and you're like, okay, we get to play LSU, who, as we've talked about, it certainly had its ups and downs. But, you've still got series against South Carolina and Vandy and, ones like that. And it's just like, I don't know, like it's going to be interesting, I think, for Ole Miss. There's certainly, to me, you kind of look at the upcoming schedule and you're thinking, all right, maybe there's a chance for them to kind of get back on track here and have an opportunity to kind of rebuild some of that confidence and at least just get a series win at this point, right? But just based on the schedule. So I think that'll be interesting. But I was also thinking too, for Mississippi State, obviously pretty important, I think, to finish the way that they did. I mean, they've been on a hot streak, like we said. You just look at how they played. They also had a nice little schedule by being able to play Kentucky and Auburn. But I think to win that series now, knowing that you're about to come to Nashville here and play Vanderbilt. I thought that was pretty important for Mississippi State now to kind of bring that momentum into Nashville again, knowing that you're going to, I mean, really, after the Vanderbilt, yes, they've got to go to South Carolina too. Then they get a chance to, finish the year with Missouri and Alabama, which you would think, two series that Mississippi State should have a pretty good chance to win. So you bring some confidence coming out of beating Ole Miss here in this series. Well, I mean, what if you can come in and get 2 of 3 from Vandy? Then you got to feel pretty good probably about where you're at if you're Mississippi State. So.
Yeah, State actually this year avoids Florida, Tennessee, and Georgia, which I think are 3 teams that are heading the NCAA tournament. Now, I think Auburn is a team that probably ends up with the easiest schedule because it doesn't play Vandy, Tennessee, or Carolina.
Yeah.
But contrast that with Ole Miss. Ole Miss doesn't play Kentucky, Missouri, and Tennessee. So basically, Mississippi State has got Georgia and Florida, where Ole Miss has got Kentucky and Missouri, and I think that makes a big difference too.
Yeah, no, that's significant, especially like I said in a season like this when you look at where some of those programs are at. So yeah, that's a significant difference in this type of season.
Trying to think what else stood out this weekend. Arkansas takes 2 or 3 from A&M, which wasn't really a surprise. And we'll talk more about this with Barry. Georgia gets 2 out of 3 over Kentucky, which I guess if you're Georgia, you would have liked to sweep, but at this point, you take that. You've got a little bit of momentum. We're going to spend Tuesday talking more about it, but anything else that caught your eye before we move on to football?
No, not really.
To basketball,
excuse me. No, like you said, I think that was kind of the thing, just in terms of, just, kind of what you're getting at this point in terms of some of these series you're going to have. I mean, like we talked about with the top 5 series, or top 6 with Mississippi State and Ole Miss, and just, you're going to get some really good games and good atmosphere. And I think down the stretch here for some of these teams we talked about, like a Georgia or some of these others, that we mentioned. I mean, look at Georgia's upcoming schedule where, they get Missouri, they get Auburn, but then they have that really just strong finish where I think it's the last 10 games of the season. They'll play top 25 teams because you got Georgia Tech in there. And they got Arkansas, Florida, Ole Miss. So I think seeing how some of teams like that kind of finish this season, and we just talked about the schedules, for some of these other teams like Mississippi State and Ole Miss. I think that's kind of what I find interesting here moving forward.
Well, I think you can now say LSU, A&M, Missouri, and Auburn are all but dead and buried. Missouri and Auburn, Auburn's 2-13. The record is going to be prohibitive.
Yeah.
And by the way, they've got Florida, Georgia coming up. I mean, it eases up. They go LSU, A&M at Missouri to end the season, but by that time it's going to be too late. Missouri just isn't talented enough. A&M, I think, is better than the record. But my goodness, Tennessee at Mississippi State, Ole Miss the next 3 weekends. When you're sitting there at 4-11, LSU, same thing, 4-11. I mean, Kentucky 7-8 hadn't really beaten a lot of teams yet, and then I think the top 9 at this point are pretty solid. Say if you're Alabama or Georgia, you want to avoid taking on a ton of losses because the committee may look at your conference record and say somebody's not getting in. But I think right now those 9 teams in pretty good shape, 4 teams that aren't, and then Kentucky with a chance to pick up some wins and prove it's legit. But I'm just not buying the Cats just yet.
Yep, I think that's certainly an interesting storyline in terms of Kentucky. I thought was, like you said, an interesting one. I mean, they came out and they won that. It was the Friday night game against Georgia, and you're thinking, okay, maybe there's a chance for them to, what if they win this series, and then you start to look ahead. But yeah, that just didn't happen. So yeah, it will be interesting to see how many teams ultimately get in. Like you said, some of these teams facing an uphill battle at this point, just based on the rest of their schedules and kind of not being able to see a lot of wins out there the rest of the way.
Well, astonishingly, it's mid-April, and we keep having basketball to talk about, Blake.
Well, we're up to 1,400 in the transfer portal now. So
one of whom was Emmanuel Miller.
Yes.
Did we mention that on Friday? I'm not sure.
No, because we didn't do our podcast Friday.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, I was traveling, so we didn't do our podcast. So Emmanuel Miller leaving Texas A&M. We talked a lot about. Well, I mean, we didn't talk a ton about him this season because, as we know, Texas A&M had quite a long pause there. But we kept saying, I mean, he was clearly the best player on that team, and for him to transfer. Certainly not ideal, I think, for Buzz Williams and when you're trying to rebuild a program, and so that's one that I think just not. I mean, but here's what I'm going to say, and I've said this to you, but nothing is going to surprise me at this point when a player transfers. Like I think with the one-time transfer rule, everything now that's in play, I'm just there's no reason for me to be surprised anymore because I just think that we're going to see this happen. Players are going to leave. Maybe we have no idea why. But I just, it's the nature of where things stand. And I think for Texas A&M, though, boy, you look at their roster. I mean, as of right now, I think you look at Texas A&M roster and look, they have a chance to bring in players, but I just don't I don't see a path for them getting out of that bottom four next season. Maybe I'm wrong. You still have it. I mean, look, there's so many transfers in the portal. Maybe they land just a top impact transfer that's going to come in right away and just make a huge impact. And maybe that changes our expectations of them. But as of right now, I think they're, a bottom four team heading into next season. They're going to be pretty young too, unless they add, an older, grad transfer type guy, or maybe a couple really at this point. So, that's not an ideal one for Texas A&M. But elsewhere, I think you look around and I don't even. Again, it's gotten to the point now where I don't even know the ones we've talked about, which ones we haven't, because there's been so many. But I think the biggest discussion is Tennessee, who was a team that has really completely sort of changed its roster, and that's what we talked about probably a week and a half ago. We said that this is the team that, as of then, it was hard to see them as a top 25 team because you just looked at all the stuff they were going to have to replace. Well, look now to where they add Brandon Huntley-Hatfield, who, one of the best players in the class. I mean, he's a 5-star freshman they're going to have coming in, a 6'9" forward who's going to come in and have, he'll start right away. I have no doubt about that. As will Kennedy Chandler. We talked about him before. One of the best point guards in the class, 5-star point guard. Both those guys are top 20, top 25-ish players in the country. And then they added, the big kid from Charlotte, Jonas. I think it's Adu. Now, it's not spelled like Abdul Adu, but I'm just going to call it Adu. If someone wants to, I'll try to look that up and find the correct pronunciation. But he's a top 60 player. And, there's another addition. We've already talked about Justin Powell. They've got other guys coming in that freshman class. So Tennessee has really revamped the roster, and then guess what? You add John Fulkerson back into the mix, who's decided he's coming back for another year. So I think Tennessee is going to be a pretty strong group when you think about the other guys that are probably going to be there. Josiah Jordan-James, Santiago Vescovi, those types of guys. I don't know that I'm ready just to put Tennessee all of a sudden into that top 10 for me just yet. And the reason why is it maybe not fair, but we had the same sort of expectations last season. And, what's the difference with this team and last season's team? That's what I want to see. And I think until I see it on the court, I don't know that I'm kind of, and I'm not to the point where, as I've talked about with Florida before, where sometimes maybe I don't give Florida enough credit just because I've not trusted their consistency in the past. I feel like I've sort of reached that point with Tennessee, and maybe they're going to be in that category of, okay, you really need to prove that you're going to be a team that maybe, can be at that top level with a pretty young roster. Like most of these guys we're talking about are going to be freshmen that are going to play a big role, but that's kind of what we talked about this past season. So even if you do have the second-ranked recruiting class in the country right now, the top class in the SEC, I still, for some reason, I just want to see Tennessee prove it before I feel like I'm going to be able to put them into the top 5 or the top 10 heading into next year.
Yeah, and look, Rick Barnes has done an A job since he's been in Knoxville. No question about it. I think he's one of my favorite coaches on the planet. I've got a lot of respect for him. But as we noted last year, the bring in a bunch of talent and throw it all together model didn't really work for them last year like we thought it would.
Yeah.
When he's had his best success, it's with veterans. And this is going to be an odd mix. And I think the other piece to it is the Brandon Huntley Hatfield commitment. He's reclassifying to 2021, so he's going to be young coming in. And sometimes that works out, and sometimes it doesn't right away. So I think that's one of the wild cards for the Vols next year is he ready to play right away at a high level?
Yeah, and I think that's always the question, and that's what we said too is, and if he is, right? And that's a team that has to lean on him and Kennedy Chandler, who is, someone, again, who's going to be a freshman. And these are young guys, but, we saw this year. Like, we saw this with 2 lottery picks with Jaden Springer and Keon Johnson. And maybe there was just, and we said it all season long, there was a missing element with this team, whatever it was. Was it, just because you didn't get what you thought you were going to get out of Pons and Fulkerson? Maybe that's it. But how this team this season is going to be different and what's the dynamic, I don't know that I can completely tell you just yet, because I think this is this kind of team that I want to see on the court before maybe I'm going to be pushing them up and saying, all right, this is your SEC, first place team, or they're going to be in the top 10 or that kind of stuff. I can understand why when you have the second best class in the country right now and the top class in the SEC, it's pretty understandable. And getting Fulkerson back, by the way, I can see why maybe people start to push them up and say, okay, this could actually be a preseason top 10 team. I mean, we said the same thing last year, and, we kind of saw that, I don't know, like there are different elements that I think with this team that I want to actually see on display first before I'm going to be one that's just running to push Tennessee all the way up into the top 10, kind of like we did last year.
Yeah, and look, no doubt, that was an outstanding development for Tennessee basketball. We're not saying that it's not. Tennessee fans, you should be excited, but I think we saw enough last year that says let's pump the brakes just a little bit before we anoint Tennessee a top 5 or a top 10 team for next year, just based on the way last year played out.
And I just want to see how they play offense, right? Like, that's the thing is you can change your roster, but offensively, there's no reason that team should have been as bad offensively as they were, because like we said, they are going to probably have 2 lottery picks. And so that's the thing is I want to see how they look offensively, because they're going to have size, like we said, with the guys they're bringing in. They're going to have size. You're adding Justin Powell too. He's going to bring an element to the offense. Kennedy Chandler, I mean, he's terrific. He'll be fine. But I want to see how everything flows offensively. They're going to have depth. I mean, we know that. They're going to have a lot of guys that probably will be able to play double-digit minutes next year, with Fulkerson coming back, with those other guys we mentioned, the returners they're going to have back. But you just want to see them put it all together on both sides of the floor, and I think that's the hesitancy you have. And it's recency bias too, where it is like if Tennessee, I don't know, let's say they get to the Sweet 16 this past year, they don't have all those bumps in the road we saw from them, where you just you're beating your head against the wall, wondering how is this team so bad offensively at times. If they're just a little bit more consistent and they don't finish the season the way that they did, we're probably a lot more optimistic about them right now, fair or unfair. But that's what goes into it sometimes. You kind of have to look at some recent trends and say, okay, this is kind of a team that was built similarly, not the exact same last year, but now, you're going to be leaning on a lot of youth again going into the season. And can those other guys, can Fulkerson come back and be that all-SEC player people thought he was going to be? Can Vescovi, can, Jordan James, can those guys, can they get to that next level? And I think until we see those types of things, it's understandable too why you can sort of say, all right, I'm going to step back, maybe take a wait and see approach on this Tennessee team, even if they're going to have probably, some of the best talent in the SEC.
Well, our presumptive number 1 team is Alabama, and Jaden Shackelford said, I think this weekend, that he is going to explore the draft but not hire an agent. What do you think about how that settles?
I think he'll be back. I don't know. Like, the draft's always interesting to me, because I just think that sometimes, it's honestly, it's the advice you're getting and what kind of, you could go in, and we've seen guys do this before, where guys go in and they just completely wow out of nowhere. Like they just, maybe scouts just all of a sudden become enamored by this guy, and all of a sudden you see a guy that you didn't expect, to be pushed up high in the draft and would have a chance to, go to that route just yet. All of a sudden he becomes a hot commodity, and it's like, okay, well, yeah, you need to go. But I think he'll be back. That's just kind of where I stand on it right now.
Devil's advocate, he goes pro. What's that do to Alabama next year?
Well, I mean, it takes them down a little bit, but I still think that with everything they have coming in,
And Javon Quinterly, by the way, was pretty good.
I was going to
especially
say,
at the end of the year.
I'm not going to say that Quinterly's just going to be completely able to replace Shackelford, but I mean, it does. It takes them down a little bit. But as we said, I mean, they got J.D. Davidson coming in. They got Charles Bediako. We mentioned those guys before. Noah Gurley, Namari Burnett. I mean, I think they've done enough to where if for some reason he did leave, like they've done enough to be able to make up some production. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So I guess it's an interesting case study. Whereas, let's say Shackelford, just for some reason, if he did leave, I still think that I would probably have Alabama as the best team in the SEC, regardless. Because they do have Burnett coming in. As we said, the Gurley addition I thought was very big for them. You got Quinterly coming back. You got, Keon Ellis coming back. Davidson's coming in, a top 10 freshman. Bediako, a top 25 freshman. I think I would still make Alabama the pick, probably.
I think I just believe in his ability, he being Nate Oates, to anticipate and put together the right pieces as much as anybody in the league. I mean, the other guy in that conversation would probably be Musselman. Well, it wouldn't probably be. It would be. But just saying, I think no matter where this goes, he just always seems to be one step ahead.
And he understands the value of having, like we said, the depth. And sometimes depth's overrated, but I don't think when you play a type of style they play, it's not overrated at all, because you've got to have, a variety of different guards and wings and perimeter guys that can fit into what you want to do. And I think by bringing in Burnett, bringing in Davidson, like we said, he's going to come in and be someone that right away, I mean, he's going to be an impact player. But you also have Quinterly, you have Ellis, you have those types of guys. So, I think he's going to find a way to make it work. But I still think that they're the team to beat.
We talked about Vanderbilt, and man, a month ago, we were just both so down on where that program was headed. They have taken a pretty big leap, though, in the right direction. They get Liam Robbins, the transfer post, last week, which really changes the dynamic of that front court. I mean, all of a sudden, Vanderbilt was really poor in the post last year, but you go at the 5 and the 4 between he and Dylan Dessou, presuming Dessou can stay healthy, and that was an issue at the end of last year, but I think he'll be okay. That's as good as most people's 4 and 5. Scottie Pippen Jr. is still in the draft at this point. I'm less sure that he goes than I was a few weeks ago. We'll wait and see there. I thought your comments about what the pros see a minute ago when we talked about Shackelford are probably appropriate here. But they landed Roddy Chapman over the weekend. And the one thing that was really their Achilles heel the last 2 or 3 years was perimeter defense. Chapman was a really good defender at Dayton, averaged almost 2 steals a game last year. And he didn't play that well last year compared to what he's been because he was hurt. But I think Vanderbilt just needed parts somewhere. And the Chapman thing, I think he helps them either way, right? I mean, he might end up being their point guard. He might slide over and start at the 2 if Pippen comes back. But either way, that's a big boost. And I think if Pippen returns, you have to start looking at them as a potential NCAA tournament team next year.
Oh yeah, I agree completely. If he comes back, I think they're in that conversation. I think the addition of Chapman is important because if you look at these teams that have struggled for Vanderbilt in recent years, one of the common themes has been experience, right? Just a lack of experience. I'm actually going through KenPom because I was curious kind of where they stood, but you go back to that 2019 team that went winless in the SEC. They ranked 304th in experience. The team last season ranked 334th in experience. The team this season ranked 255th in experience. So I think the more older guys you can add, knowing that they've kind of had to build off of younger guys the past several years, or they've had a lot of new guys on their roster, I mean, I think that's important, is any guys you can get like that. And I think the fact is, now they bring in Chapman, who's a guy who, as you said, has played a lot of years in college thus far. Like, he's a guy who's been around. Same thing with Robbins, like an upperclassman guy who can come in right away, having already played 3 seasons in the Big Ten. And so I think that's the biggest thing for me is just having older, experienced guys that will be able to help them win some of those close games, because that's the theme we kept talking about, right? Is how many close games is this team going to lose, and it wound up being a ton. So I think having more older guys that have been in those spots before, that's where you turn 8 of those losses into maybe 4 wins, and you go 4-4 instead of 0-8 in some of those games, and then you're looking at a much different scenario.
Blake, we have hit 3 sports today and hit a lot on all 3 sports.
We'll talk about a little soccer, a little gymnastics. What else? What else we got? So
not going there. Got too much as it is. But I challenge you to find a podcast that talked more in depth about any 3 SEC sports than we did today. But anything we missed as we end this show.
No, just check everything out at southeastern14.com. As we said, with spring games going and everything like that, we'll have some football stuff coming. Lots of baseball coverage. We've got you up to date on everything. So just, check out the site. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Any podcast app you use, you can find us there. And just follow us on Twitter at 14 Southeastern.
Yeah, power rankings coming too, by the way. We will do teams today and then probably pitchers on Tuesday and hitters on Wednesday. That's been a fun thing to put together. I waited a few weeks until we had enough sample. I just don't like to make sweeping judgments 10, 15 games into the season. Right. But here we are. It's the time of the year where we can start talking player of the year. And of course, everybody always likes to debate best teams. And we got a lot to talk about, so that'll be up at the site too.
Yep. Check it all out. And lots of great stuff coming over there. So.
All right. For Blake Lovell, I'm Chris Lee, the host of the 14. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again on Tuesday.